Good evening and welcome to ESMT Berlin. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the inauguration of the Ingrid and Manfred Gentz Chair in Business and Society. And this obviously, in particular, a very warm welcome to Ingrid and Manfred Gentz, those who provided the chair and gave their name to the chair, and to Professor Gianluca Carnabucci, who is going to be, actually is, the first shareholder. This is the first privately funded chair at ESMT. So therefore, it means a lot to us. It means a lot to what we want to achieve. And I'd like to put this chair in a broader context of what we've done before and what we obviously would also like to do with the chair. So many of you, most of you, I think all of us know ESMT was founded in 2002 by 25 leading global companies and institutions. And one of these companies was Daimler. I think at that point, Daimler Chrysler. And it was Dr. Gentz, who was a board member at this point of time, and he was one of the driving distinguished leaders who actually made ESMT possible to make it out of an idea into something that is now the leading business school in Germany. The idea that the leaders, including Dr. Gentz, then had was really to create an internationally oriented business school, one that can compete with business schools all around the world. And now when we look at the international feature of our school today, we have, and we have to count each year because it changes, we have now in our degree programs alone, students from 65 different countries. So we really have students from all over the world who come here to study here. We have also, and this is very important, we have more than 3,000 business leaders in executive education programs who come to ESMT each year. So something that is very important, and I should also say executive education was even there when degree programs were not there yet. Most importantly, obviously, this only is possible with a very international faculty as well. The faculty comes again from all over the world, wins awards, provides commitment to academic excellence, and this may be also being, made easier by the right to grant PhDs, which we got in 2013, and also got the right to do it alone last year. When you look at the profile, not only of the students, but also at the programs that we run, there are different things that are worth mentioning. So, for example, we now started last year our first degree program abroad, which is in Doha, in Qatar, jointly with the Doha Institute. We have, as you may have seen in the Financial Times this week, we formed an alliance with other leading business schools around the world to think more and to tackle the issue of blended learning, online learning. So all these, all these pieces of evidence for the internationalization and the fact that we'd like to be operate on a global scale. So therefore, I would say whatever was the idea at the point of time when Dr. Gentz, others, the companies founded ESMT, today it is a business school that is very internationally oriented and that sticks to this international commitment. Faculty members, 34 of them from 17 different countries, and they obviously are those who really grow our reputation and show not only the rigor but also the relevance that academic research in business can provide to different pieces and different stakeholders, starting with corporate leaders, investors, policymakers, representatives of civil society. And in that sense, you could say the chair that we inaugurate today is the best example of this link between business and society, also the societal part that plays a very important role here. Now let me now start by saying a few more words on Gianluca, who in my view is the best possible candidate for this chair. Gianluca is a professor at ESMT. He started here in 2016. He's also the Associate Dean of Executive Education. On his background, he received his PhD in Social and Behavioral Science from the University in Amsterdam in 2005. And before joining ESMT, he was an associate professor at the University of Lugano in Switzerland, where he also directed, obviously also very important, the PhD program in management. He has held numerous highly prestigious duties outside ESMT. So, for example, he has served on the research committee of the Organization and Management Theory Division of the Academy of Management. And since last year, which is again highly prestigious, he's on the editorial review board of Organization Science, one of the leading management journals in the world. His research has appeared just there, but also in other journals, including the Academy of Management Journal, the Journal of Management, the Journal of Organizational Behavior. So in that sense, his academic credentials are, without any doubt, a role model for many of us here at ESMT. And at the same time, what he does, what he researches in, so for example, topics of organization theory, organizational behavior, organizational design and change, networks, negotiation, leadership, these are, in a sense, exactly those topics that really enrich this chair in business and society. So for example, Gianluca looks into questions of how informal networks affect economically important phenomena such as innovation, competition, leadership. So all these topics that are so high on our agenda as a school, but moreover, are very high on the agenda of the economic development more broadly. His work speaks to the value of rigorous scientific approach to corporate responsibility. So again, something that is very much at the core of how and why ESMT was founded. And he speaks and he builds on this not only in theory, but also in practice on how relationship is built on trust. So trust being a necessary, very important ingredient to the sharing and the development of responsibility. And in particular, when one looks at this from a network perspective, then this trust should be derived from networks that thrive on value-driven knowledge. And again, this value-driven knowledge is something that this chair should incorporate in its best possible sense. So in that sense, I've alluded to this already. It means that what Gianluca does, the type of work he does, but also the type he does beyond his academic work, the outreach he has in his work and his ideas to business and society, make him the ideal candidate for this chair. And I would like to say that many of the ideals he shares with Manfred Gentz. I think it would probably take too much time if I listed now all the numerous corporate and highly prestigious positions Dr. Gentz has had. So therefore, I'd like to concentrate on some of those that may be less known, but that speak very highly of of the ideas that are behind this chair. So in particular, and for example, from 1998 to 2000, Dr. Gentz helped lead an initiative to compensate the forced laborers that had to work in Germany before World War II. And due to this initiative, this very important initiative, which became known in English translation as Remembrance, Responsibility, Future, it created the opportunities for compensation for those who were forced to work in Germany in those dark times of German history. It brought together, I think this is probably one of the most, maybe the most significant fundraising efforts one can think of. It brought together 6,500 German companies to bring together, jointly with government means, 10 million Deutschmark, or a little bit more than 5 billion euros. So, and it's very important also to say that Dr. Gentz not only initiated and was a very important driving force in this, but he also continued to work in this initiative beyond, serving on the board from 2000 to 2008. I can also say from my own conversations with Ingrid and Manfred Gentz, there are many other very important contributions they provide to various parts that far go beyond business. So in that sense, again, taking into account this notion of business and society. And again, it probably would go beyond the capacity of the time that was allocated to me to go to all of them. But I think many of you who are here know how well and how much they contribute of their time to philanthropic initiatives, organizations here in Berlin and Brandenburg in various parts such as arts, culture, science, scholarship. So in that sense, we are delighted, and it takes us with a lot of pride that you say beyond founding and creating ESMT now also provide such a significant commitment to our research and what we'd like to do going forward. So therefore, the question of ethical responsibility is not something that just is something that is said, but it is really embedded in action. It is embedded in also what we'd like to do with the share. And it is, in that sense, a very vivid, a very strong statement on ethical responsibility by business, but also for all the other parts of society that we need to think about, state, private companies, and leaders. So in that sense, before we go into the discussion, I think And I would like to use this opportunity to thank very much Ingrid and Manfred Gentz for providing this chair to ESMT. It's a wonderful signal to us. It's a wonderful moment for us, and I'd like to thank you very much for this. And I can say, and I know this is shared by Gianluca, we will now obviously make the best of how really make this chair work and cherish. With this, I'd like to hand over indeed to Dr. Gentz. And for me, this was really just the opening remarks. Now it's really the responsibility of the chair provider to officially inaugurate the chair. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Gentz. Thank you.
Dear Mr. President, dear guests, Jörg, thank you very much for your kind introduction, which paid Ingrid and myself more respect and praise than especially I deserve. Thanks also to ESMT for organizing this event, and Gianluca, who accepted the burden to take care of business and society in ESMT. And last but not least, thanks to all of those who helped to find this excellent scientist, and to all of you coming here and joining us in an idea. I was struggling, I am struggling with for many, many years already. Why did Ingrid and I decide to finance this chair for the next 5 years? First of all, we want to give back something to society in which we live in freedom, democracy, and peace. It gave us a chance to develop ourselves in a free and social economy, and also to generate some wealth. Societies and business have become more and more complex through globalization, new technologies, big data, and actually by artificial intelligence, whatever you understand under this headline. So in our lives and in business, it became much more difficult to make decisions on awareness and responsibility. We obviously need orientation to evaluate what is good or bad, right or wrong, and what is acceptable or not acceptable. We always have to evaluate risks, including unintended damages and side effects. But do we really have a sort of a yardstick or adequate standards? Now you may ask, do we not have enough rules for necessary orientation? We have lots of laws, lots of recommendations from corporate governance codes, lots of rules coming as internal rules within companies. And we are getting more and more of those, including compliance regulation, because whenever a serious problem shows up, and even more when it is scandalized in public opinion, legislators or rule makers try to help with additional or more detailed laws. Why is that not sufficient? First of all, not any legislator or rule maker is able to foresee all potential problems and have adequate answers. They are always running behind because they react mostly after something has happened. Second, every regulation is limiting our freedom, often in a very unnecessary way. This is also true for the entrepreneurial freedom. The more detailed laws we have, the smaller becomes the remaining freedom. So what we really need is an additional orientation, if you want to, a moral or ethical compass. This compass should help decision makers to find answers how to decide and behave in newly upcoming problems or in such ones where rules do not really fit and give no answer on a very special situation in question. Sometimes it helps to think about the intention of the regulator and to take his accepted intention for orientation to further develop answers based on the values behind the rule. On more general terms, we should in our decisions, in our behavior, follow accepted values in business and society. For business, these values can be subsumed under the generic term of ehrbarer Kaufmann. This stands for attitudes of values-based behavior like fairness, honesty, reliability, openness, and so on. The chair should do further research in this direction and communicate it. It should not do it only in the abstract and in theory, but should keep in mind the application in day-to-day business without generating recipes. The questions I briefly touched upon are not only relevant for business, they are also fundamental for our behavior and attitude in society. So Gianluca and ESMT, make the best out of it. Thank you.
So welcome everybody and thank you for being here, and thank you Mr. and Mrs. Gentz for all what you're doing for the school. I feel deeply honored, and I have to admit I feel the burden of this chair a little bit. I am going to try my very best, and I think the school is going to support me to try and do everything we can to pursue the values that you stand for, and I think the school stands for as well. I have been asked to make a presentation today, and I have been wondering what could I present. My life is split between, if I exclude my private side, teaching and research. And the two sides of my professional life are tightly interlinked. But rather than exploring what I tend to do for my teaching, I thought it would be important for me to be able to present some of my research work, because I think it's essential that we understand that research is at the basis of pretty much everything we do as a business school. Being able to convert the research findings we have into something that has relevance for business and enables us to address some of the fundamental questions that have an ethical foundation as well as a social and economic foundation is going to be, I think, the only way in which you can address these questions effectively. So what I'm going to try to talk about today is one project. It's a research project. I'm going to try my very best to keep the jargon as simple as possible, I promise. But I do care very much about showing how research is actually pretty close to some of the things that we are concerned with in our daily life. And there are many points in which, during the dinners we've had with Dr. Gentz and Ingrid Gentz, we found points of contact in the way that we think about things. I have a lot to learn, but there are elements in which I already see a consonance in how we think about aspects of how people make decisions in and outside organizations. And one that I would like to start with is Dr. Gentz referred in his introductory speech to the fact that there's a tendency in society to make rules out of everything, to formalize everything we can. And if I show you that graph, I think everyone will very readily understand what is it that I'm talking about. Everyone who has been in an organization or has dealt with anyone in an organization will know that's an organization chart. This is a true organization. The names are fictitious, but the organization is out there. It's a division of a large company in the oil industry. And when we show this thing to people, everybody knows there's a lot of information in this thing. There are lines and boxes that have to do a lot with how people make decisions inside organizations, and authority is obviously the main aspect of what you can see here. Those little lines out here define who can make a decision about what, who reports to whom. And then there are boxes that separate areas, such as production, drilling, exploration in this toy example. Those are also elements of how the bureaucracy, as Max Weber called it, organizes our life when we are at work. It is part of how rules and bureaucracies become part of our daily life. These things are essential. We can't do without them. But the more we study how organizations actually work, the more we realize that this is only one, perhaps not even the most important side of what makes organizations work and how people make decisions inside organizations. So this thing you see to the side is the very same organization. It's the very same people. The only difference now is that through research, people have, we have looked at the same organization and we have explored a side that's not visible in the organization chart. And that is who trusts whom in that organization. And trust is something that does not appear in the organization chart. It cannot appear in any rule or bureaucracy, but it is a fundamental component of how we relate to each other in the microcosmos of an organization, like in this example, and in the research piece that I'm going to present, as well as when we think about society broadly speaking. There are different ways in which we can think about trust, but the one that we're going to look at with this particular paper is interpersonal trust. In your workplace, just very much like among your circle of friends and acquaintances, I'm pretty certain you recognize there are some people who you perceive you can trust really easily and others who you don't. Now, this difference, do you trust that particular person, yes or no, is hugely important, it turns out, for the functioning of individuals within organizations, as well as for the overall functioning of organizations. Because the information that circulates inside organizations depends probably more on this than it depends on this. And because we make decisions based on the information we have, the kind of network structure that arises inside an organization and what position a particular individual occupies in that network structure matter enormously for all kinds of really relevant outcomes that we care about. In this particular study, when we do research, there's one caveat that I think we need to clarify for those of us in the room who don't do research as a profession. Research is beautiful, but requires enormous focus. We have to dig down deeply, which requires that we look at very simple questions, which we can demonstrate or answer as compellingly as possible, and then we put them together to try and make sure that we have a comprehensive picture. So don't be surprised that the particular question I'm going to look at might seem, from the perspective of the non-researcher, limited, but it is actually a highly consequential phenomenon that we're looking at. What we're going to look at in this study is these particular types of trust-based relationships. Why do we care about those two ties in particular? Because those are ties that have one very important characteristic. They cut across the organizational silos. If you compare the left-hand side and the right-hand side, you'll notice one thing that we find in literally every single organization we look at. It doesn't matter how big it is. From a small scale network like this one to a very large network with thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals. People tend to trust the ones who are close to them in the organization, who are within their own organizational silo. All organizations have these silos. There's no way to avoid the silos. However, what these silos do, among many other things, is they constrain trust within the boundaries of those who you understand well, because they're part of the same silo. And what that means is information also tends to only circulate within the silo, and it becomes extremely difficult for people to understand how do other people in the other silos see the problem that we're addressing. This creates all kinds of issues related to conflict, for example, and an inability to use the resources we have in organizations to make good decisions. This thing happens at all scales. We're looking at a micro example. This very same thing happens at a macro level of entire societies. The more we create boundaries that cohere within, because they form a group that's cohesive inside, the more we generate boundaries that differentiate us from the rest, and trust becomes difficult to build, and all kinds of economically related and socially related phenomenon, they are affected by this. So the question that we're going to try to ask today is, how do these kinds of ties in particular affect the performance of individuals? There's a lot of research around this topics, but what we're going to talk about is in particular this question. Now, why do we care about that question? Because there's a lot of research internationally. I myself and a couple of other people in this room, for that matter, are interested in that question. It turns out that these kind of ties are really fundamentally important for the overall functioning of organizations, and that the people who are able to to develop these ties, they actually generally they make better decisions. They make decisions that enable them to see things that other people in other parts of the organizations cannot see, simply because they don't receive information. So the evidence is accumulating that these roles are particularly important, these ties are particularly important. And why is that so? Well, primarily because people who are stuck within a silo, they will only see information, behaviors, attitudes that are known within that silo. The values that they're exposed to are the local ones, but once they interact with people in different silos, they just have no idea how to interact with them. They don't understand them, they find them to be hostile, even when there is no hostility, and it's very hard for them to create an interface that works. So the people who do build these ties, being exposed to a diversity of information, attitudes, perspectives, views, and values, they somehow have their mind expanded, stretched, and they become better able to understand things from a broader purview. They don't only look at their local silo, but they learn to expose to the broader organization. So this argument is well established. There's a lot of research out there, but most of the research we have is correlational. We see that the people who are in that particular position, building ties of that kind, they tend to become extremely influential and perform very highly inside organizations. But there's very little evidence to date that that is actually a causal effect. Now, here's where the researchers in the room should get excited, and everybody else might wonder, and who the hell cares? We should care about causality, even if we're not researchers, because if we're able to establish a causal relationship between a particular kind of behavior, for example, the ability to build a trust-based relationship across the silos, and the effect that this behavior has on people, then we can really comfortably say we go out and teach evidence-based management, leadership. That's my goal here. There are issues with the evidence we have currently. For example, if I am at the center of a network, like this person over here, is it because, and I perform very well, and the organization recognizes my value, they see that I'm actually bringing in perspectives and novelty in the organization, and that this is crucial for the organization as a whole to work? Is it because I have developed these ties? Or is it because I'm so great that everybody wants to connect with me? Is trust a consequence or a cause? The theory says it's a cause, and what we're trying to do here is we're going to try to test this theory. How do we do it? A field experiment. We go inside a real organization. Oftentimes, I do research in really large companies with lots and lots and lots and lots of data. I'm all for big data. But sometimes you have to go micro, to address these questions more precisely. So what we did is I used my Italian connections to get into an Italian, it's the business unit of a global semiconductor company. This particular business unit is pretty small, but technologically extremely advanced, and it's based in Italy, north of Italy. What did we do? Well, it's about 170 people, so very small scale, but highly knowledge intensive. They do a lot of research, they do a lot of novel things. They're the only ones to produce semiconductors they have a unique technology to do that. We followed them for 2.5 years, regularly, and that meant spending literally a lot of time inside the company, doing a lot of qualitative research to make sure that we did the experiment right. This is an organization with 25% women. I'll tell you why this matters in a minute. What have we done? We've used the other side of my professional life, my teaching side, as a treatment in an experimental approach. Typically, if you think about an experiment, you'll think about something like a drug, a pill that you give to people, right? And what you'll do is you'll have some people take the pill, some people take a placebo, some people don't take anything. You may have different protocols, different approaches, but typically it's a drug that you're testing, okay? Here, our drug, I don't know that we want to record that. I mean, I don't know that we want to call it a drug, but our treatment is a day of executive education. What do we do in this day of executive education? We teach people 2 things. First, building these trust-based relationships across silos is beneficial. And we show them evidence of this. Second, building this kind of relationships is about the most difficult thing you can do inside an organization. Most people get burned as they try to build those things. Because building trust with people who are like you inside your own silo is relatively easy. You're all of one mind. You know each other well, same culture, and everything is smooth. But when you start to deal with people who see things very differently from you, then building trust becomes difficult. Most people fail, even when they try. So then, the second part of the executive education day was on how can you best approach people across silos when you try to establish credibility, to show them you have competence and character. They can trust you. So with this day of executive education, the treatment in experimental terms, we give people a reason to want to try to build bridging relationships across silos, and we tell them how. We help them see how you do this best. And we want this to generate what technically we call an exogenous variation in people's networks. What does that mean? That we want people to change their network in a way that they would not change in the absence of this treatment. That is the only way we have to make sure that we can then assess, has this newly built bridging relationship actually affected how people work, their performance, and therefore the organization's overall performance. Here's the timeline. 2.5 years long. We followed them, and we took measurements at 4, in fact 5, but we leave the 5th time wave aside for the purpose of this experiment. So we followed them for 2.5 years and measured things 4 times in a row. The intervention happens here. So we know all kinds of things about these people well before we even do the intervention, and then we followed these people, these very same people, after the intervention. And what we observe is their network, a bunch of variables that tell us pretty much everything about these people, as well as, of course, what kind of network structure do they have, who trusts these people, and where are the people who trust these people located in that initial network that I showed you. And then we want to see if this intervention, the day of executive education, changes the way people build their networks into the future, and if that change in the trust network affects these people's performance. Okay? All good? Now, the key to experiments is, of course, that we need to randomize who takes part in the network. Just like we do in medicine, you need to randomly select the people who take the treatment. Same thing we do here. In that organization, we take half of the organization, randomly selected, and they get to do my executive education. The other half don't. Actually, they do take it, but after the experiment, so that they don't Yes, so that they don't affect the way in which we can test our arguments. This is the network pre and after, just to give you a sense. From that, you can't see much, but that is mathematics. Everything that's in that network has a visual component, but it's quantifiable very precisely. And that's what we do in network research, and particularly in this research. All right, so how do we assess causality? There are three components to this design. A randomized treatment, who is selected randomly to take part in the executive education day. Then this thing should affect, down the line, a few months after, did these people actually form new trust-based ties that cut across the silos? And then, several months later, do these exogenously generated, that means those generated by the treatment, ties that cut across holes, do they affect these people's performance in terms of their ability to come up with better decisions that are novel and that the organization rewards? This is measured by others, not by the people who are in the experiment themselves, but by their supervisor, who are the same people who assessed individuals, employees, managers in this organization anyway. So these are independent assessors in a way, but they understand the context very well. Ideally, what we want to see, if we're right with this theory, is that the randomized treatment works, that it does increase the likelihood that people who got the treatment significantly venture outside of their silo and form trust-based ties across silos. And then we also want to see that these ties that have been exogenously generated positively affect these people's performance as evaluated by their supervisors several months afterwards. Building trust ties takes time. That's why we need to have a sufficiently long time span for people to realize this effect here, and then to see whether this actually affects their performance later. And this is more for the research side of the audience, we try to have an extremely conservative model where we even control for people's prior performance as well as for their prior network structure, which is an overkill in many ways, but that's because we really want to tease out, is there such a causal effect and can we quantify it? Here are the results. These are numbers, but what that means is the theory applies and is confirmed, even in the most conservative test that we have come up with. We've tried it in a million different ways. Even the most conservative of the tests we've tried has a significant effect. The randomized treatment changes the way in which people build their networks. It changes their network structure. People who have gone through the executive education day tend to have more bridging relationships across silos compared to the ones who have not taken the treatment a few months after the treatment. And these exogenously generated ties positively affect these people's performance in the organization. These people tend to be better at making decisions because of these silos cut-in relationships, these relationships that cut across the silos. This might be my research angle, but I get totally excited about this. It may seem small, but this is huge. It's huge because it tells us that building trust is not just something you ought to do. It's for yourself. It's not just something that has only an ethical foundation. It is actually at the root of how people can help organizations work better and how themselves can help, how you can help yourself work better. It also tells us that the natural tendency towards building silos inside organizations, despite being natural, can be counteracted by individuals who have leadership. That's one of the things that I tend to teach in class. Leadership oftentimes means that you feel ready to cut across the silos that nobody else wants to cut across. And that is good for you because it expands your mind. And it makes you a better decision maker. And it forces you to make decisions not just based on what you're used to and what your local culture demands, but rather by taking a broader perspective. And this is good for the organization too. So it's a small finding, but with very broad implications. Now let's go to the darker side of all this. We have very precise, fine-grained evidence to see if this effect applies equally to different kinds of people. One question that I personally have been very interested in for several years now is the differences that men and women confront when they try to exert their leadership at all levels. So among many other questions that we have looked at, we looked at whether this causal process, which is there, is the same, applies in the same way for men and women. It ought to do so, because it's about the kind of information people receive and therefore how they make decisions. It ought to do so because there's no reason to imagine that men and women would build trust differently, either within or across silos. So there should be no difference, but when we asked the question, does this causal process differ for men and women, we found that yes, it does. And it does in exactly the way that we would not like to hear, but that we see over and over again in the data, no matter how we look at it. Women doing exactly the same things as men, they get penalized. It doesn't matter how they do things, they get penalized. Corporations are structured in a way that favors males, and there's a million reasons why that happens, but we've got to figure out exactly at what point in the process this happens. Now here, this is causal evidence. Now this particular aspect, particularly I'm looking at my colleague Raji, who is the toughest econometrician around. And we call her the identification police. If I say something wrong, she's gonna beat me in the head, so I need to be very careful. But this is evidence that I think is very solid to show the following thing. When we treat men and women with the Executive Education Day, they respond in exactly the same way. If anything, women respond slightly more positively than men. Their likelihood of building bridging ties across silos is actually slightly higher, not statistically significant, but slightly higher. But when you look at the fact that these bridging ties generate on supervisors' evaluations of women performance, then we see that for women, the positive effect that is there for men disappears entirely. So that's another way to say, sometimes we think that women don't build entrepreneurial leadership inside organizations because it's in their nature not to do so. This argument more and more turns out to be false, and this is yet another example of this. Women, given the opportunity to build these ties, respond as well, perhaps better than men. But when they do build these ties, which are beneficial for men and which are beneficial for companies, the reaction that they get is different than what a man gets. And all of the positive effect tends to disappear. I got to this as an example of how solid, evidence-based research that does a good job at teasing out granular processes, as opposed to just thinking broadly about questions, can actually get you to the very heart of some of these important societal questions. It's just one of many other examples that I could have brought, even within this single study. There are many other things that we have found out. But I think it's illustrative, and I figured at least half of the audience should be interested. So, conclusions. What we have found with this research is that bridging relationships based on trust across silos inside the organization is important for people's performance, and it affects their ability to contribute to their organization by bringing out innovative ideas and improving their decision-making. We've also found that the magnitude of this effect is very different for men and women, and to be frank, the effect is it disappears entirely for women. And finally, I thought that's also an important thing for us to realize. We've also found, as a side note to this research, that a single day of executive education taught by an ESMT professor, I don't know about the other business schools, but certainly a single day taught by an ESMT professor generates a causal effect in people's networks. These are things that are long-lasting, and it affects their performance as a consequence of that. That, I think, is evidence-based research on leadership. Thank you very much. Here?
Let's do it.
Yeah. Here? Yeah. You should sit at the center. Right?
Exactly. So,
That's very interesting.
thank you very much to both of you. I would like to start by saying actually what you ended up by saying, I think we should rewrite our marketing materials and simply use your research for the evidence that comes into it. I would like to start with a question to Manfred. So Gianluca, in his research, talks a lot about the building of trust and the importance of that. And now from your insight in coming up with and creating different ventures, such as ESMT, but also the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility, Future, but obviously also in your corporate function, how would you assess this trust building, how to get there and how to make it work?
First of all, I want to say trust is very, very important for any relationship. And the functioning of a economic system, be it a company or the whole system, a market system, is built on trust. Because once you go to a dealer, buy a car, in the end, you trust that the car is okay. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. And that is for all relationships within a company and outside of a company. What you are saying in your experiment is once you leave the silos and have connections, close connections, trustful connections outside of the silo, it gives you better ideas and gives you a better performance. What I don't understand is why is the reaction on women so negative or zero and so positive as far as men are concerned? This is something which is, at least for me, not evident why that is. Perhaps you can answer the question.
Yeah, although this is obviously a complex question, but I think collectively the academic community has found an answer to this. The single most important factor turns out to be something that we all understand very well. It's stereotypes. And, you know, in a technical sense, a stereotype is something that we need. Every one of us has stereotypes about everything, and we need to have them because otherwise the cognitive load we need to process would be too high. So we need stereotypes. Now, the problem with stereotypes is that they tend to create mental associations in people that then affect these people's decisions and behaviors. One of the key stereotypes we have with women in the workplace is that there is a positive association in people's minds concerning being a woman and being nurturing and caring, and a negative association between being a woman and being entrepreneurial and assertive. What that means is if I interact with a woman, my default expectation will be she's gonna be somebody who cares. That will be something that fits well my stereotype, you know, about people, about social harmony and all of these things. But when I get to interact with a woman who shows entrepreneurial attitude, maybe cutting across the bureaucracy, the rules a little bit, cutting across the silos, the boundaries that are present in organizations, that is counter-normative. That, you know, collides with my default stereotype. And that turns out to be something to which people react against. The short answer, this was the long one, the short answer is the following. Most of the issues that we see emerge around gender in organizations, most of those issues don't depend on blatantly macho, chauvinist people who hate women, but rather from people like, I'm afraid, me and you, or everybody else in the room, normal people with, let me say, good values, but nevertheless with very deeply rooted mental stereotypes that affect how we make decisions inadvertently. So awareness is the key to changing that.
And that is possible.
Absolutely.
Okay. Then you should work on that.
Absolutely.
And so this is, again, executive education that comes into play.
Again.
So I would like to actually come back to one of the aspects that Manfred mentioned in his opening remarks. So when we think of the nature of the firm, then there's a lot of talk about transaction costs. And what I'd like to understand is to what extent does the trust actually reduce those transaction costs in terms of, for example, codifying or writing contracts on each and everything, and rather reducing them by saying, okay, I can trust someone, so I don't have to put it in writing, but I simply believe that what we discuss would also hold tomorrow.
Well, the answer is, it is obvious. Once you trust people, you don't believe that you always have to control what he's doing and whether he's reliable or not. That is basically the reason why you trust him, that he is reliable. The problem today is that I would say people tend more to trust each other, but perhaps there are other stereotypes that, for example, some business partners you cannot trust as much as other ones. That is basically, if you say today you can't trust the Americans anymore because there's a Trump, or you cannot trust Chinese people because they are known that they are misusing, for example, licenses, they are copying without paying, or whatever you want to it. That are prejudices, and why it is so, you introduce controls via attorneys, lawyers, and whatever it is, and becomes more and more and more expensive. And in the end, you do not understand what the lawyers tell you, because it's so highly complicated that, and they could say that also in a simple term, but they don't, because that is a business model. But again, yeah, well, I think one has to know that, especially if you, that is not so much evident as far as business doing in Germany. Being in business internationally, that is the typical pattern, especially if you deal with American companies. And lawyers are always asking and trying to tell you, you have to be protected against potential liabilities, and therefore all these long contracts, but it's completely counterproductive as far as trust is concerned.
Gianluca, maybe following up on this, now when we look at these major trends, digitalization, internationalization, so therefore having to deal with more people around the world in completely different regions of the world, how is the trust building affected by that? Is it becoming more difficult? Is it easier because we are still, it's easier to connect? What is your view?
So I think this, of course, this is a complicated question, but I think there's one part of it which I think is particularly relevant on a societal scale, which also I think pushes us to think rigorously about trust itself, which sometimes, despite it being the currency of societies, healthy societies, it also sometimes may have negative consequences if you think about how it operates on a global scale. Because trust, just like in the microcosmos of organizations, you tend to see trust cluster inside local silos. The same happens on a global scale,
yes,
where trust tends to be something that's a lot easier to build within your own local culture and community than across. And this is, just like in organizations, it's exactly the same process. In-group dynamics tend to reinforce this process, so that inside an organization, when a particular group feels that they are different from the other groups, that at the same time facilitates the trust-building process inside the group, while at the same time thickening the boundaries across groups, which complicates all kinds of really vital processes for organizations. Similarly, on a societal level, a lot of the tendencies we see nowadays with nationalism, that's generating trust internally in a way that's dysfunctional at the system level. Because all of this internal trust is exclusive. It's exclusionary, I think you may say in English. It prevents or it complicates the process by which you build trust across nations and cultures, which I think in a globalized society is the most vital aspect of how we can keep humanity together.
Good. So we also have time for one or two questions from you. Please.
Basically, I think this leads me to another question. Because to a certain degree, trust can be dysfunctional. It can be misused. So you need necessarily, to a certain degree, also control mechanisms. And the question is how to balance that. That is also an economic problem. Coming back to contracts which you have with American companies, in the end, you are not asked to trust your partner. You are asked to trust your lawyer, which is a difference. For a very simple reason, you get a convolute of 300, 500 pages as a contract to make sure that nothing happens. But you are never ever able to understand these contracts or even to read them. So you have to trust your lawyer, but not your partner. And that is something which is also sort of a dangerous development, because in the end you should trust your partner.
Yes.
So we have a question here.
I like to use an example from the Ehrbare Kaufmann. I was studying how Heinemann, who is selling in the airport shops, organizes its supplies. And the question is, should you have your own logistics or not? And they outsource the logistics, and they have a one-page contract with a spediteur, and every year they sit together, they send each other a bill, and every year they discuss if there was something wrong. So a one-page contract, and the rest is based on trust. So they are very good examples of just confirming what you mentioned.
Okay. I didn't know that they have so simple contracts. That is something which I'm always was aiming for.
Please.
Gentlemen, ladies, gentlemen, my name is Hans. I have the chance to listen to you, and I appreciate very much to be here. I'm a transaction lawyer with an MBA from IMD in '87. Sir, what you're saying, my fantasy, you have made your questionnaire to people in an Italian business unit. So trust is a clear function of culture. So when you go to Denmark or Norway, the function might change if you put it in a mathematical phrase. You might have other aspects which you can develop. So what is your fantasy, sir? Just your fantasy. When you would put your questionnaire in a 2.5-year survey in Norway or Denmark or maybe Iceland, where girls, ladies, women play a much bigger role than they do in the Italian culture, where the ladies are more in the background of the family and the business, as we may know from Benetton or something similar. Am I clear to?
Completely clear. So I have the luxury of being a professor. What that means is that that can be more than just a fantasy. I can do a research project and look. And do you want to help? Absolutely. So there's several important business leaders around here. I'm all for expanding this research internationally and to explore many other related questions. That's the beauty of my job primarily when it comes to the research side. If you go from having a fantasy that you think is worthwhile investing time and money in because it's relevant, because it's important, then if you're serious enough, you build a research program around it. And I do take your question as a challenge for myself as well as for people who may give access the data in companies. You give me access, I'm going to be the happiest person. I am ready to bet that the results I have are general, but it should be probed empirically. But I am ready to bet that those are general because we have, this is not the first research. There has been a lot of research around, and there's a fairly strong theoretical background behind all this. I would be very surprised if we found something completely different, but I do think we should go out and explore. Absolutely.
There's actually research in the economics and finance area that looks into something Gianluca mentioned, which basically asks the question, business men and women, from which country do you trust most? And the answer is, it's always those from the same country, with one exception, but I forgot the country.
It's probably Liechtenstein.
So Henry.
So I think it was very important to think about the downsides of trust as well. And you kind of made almost like an assumption that building trust within the group means you cannot trust the out-group. And I know there is the in-group, out-group discussion, but I think if we want to think forward, the question is, what can we do so that building trust inside does not have to mean distrust to the outside? Because in some sense, this is the ideal state we want to be in.
Absolutely. Very much agree upon. I think the natural tendency would be the in-group, out-group dynamics. So the more you focus on the inside, the thicker become the boundaries. But your question is more normative in nature. Is there any way that we can somehow, let me say, educate in a very noble sense, each other to do both things at the same time, to be able to build trust locally around yourself in your group, while at the same time being respectful and trustful of people in other local cultures? Absolutely. Well taken. Yeah.
So do we have more questions?
If I may add one point. Look, I use very often that generic term of ehrbarer Kaufmann. Typically, this is something which came up in the end of the 11th or 12th century, first, by the way, in Italy, and then was brought to the north. And in Germany, it was for a very long time, the attitude of businessmen, dealers, more or less dealers, and they had to trust that it was outside of their own company. It was a group of international dealers, Händler in Germany, in German. They had to trust each other, and they built trust to the outside. There was also a component in the inside, because society reacted with excluding people if society got the feeling they misused the trust, they were behaving in the wrong way, they were not invited anymore, and you didn't do business anymore with these people. So it is possible, but I think that it was much easier at that time because all these people knew each other personally, which is today almost impossible. And instead of that, you rely on data, which more or less are anonymous.
Linus.
Yes, so I had a question. So Gianluca has been a very like colleague here, so of course, so I wanted to very much learn from Gianluca about how he built his fantastic network at ESMT afterwards. But I had a question because I think it ties into this discussion about the role of technologies that can be used to facilitate these connections that Dr. Gentz actually raised. And I think a remarkable thing about the new economy and digitalization is that people tend to trust strangers, right? That all of a sudden we have this sharing economy, where couch surfing, open source communities, all kinds of things where you trust people where perhaps sometimes you shouldn't trust them. And if you think about many of these things are facilitated by recommendation systems, but when they start, they have exactly 0 recommendations. So how can you, as organizations, think about the kinds of actions that they go through in order for you to actually trust strangers? Because I think that's one of the beauties that organizations can do, that you trust people that are sometimes not worthy of trust because you don't have any prior information about these individuals.
Here's the question. I'd rather defer. Linus always asks difficult questions, so if you have a...
Now, how do you facilitate connections when trust perhaps is not warranted, when you don't have any prior information? I think that's really like the very important question in these days, that you often trust strangers, right?
Yep.
But what can you do in order to facilitate these connections? It's obviously a bit different from the Italian business unit, where you see them, you have espresso, you go together for pasta afterwards, you have a drink. Or
Talking about
like
stereotypes, those are
sorry.
other examples. Yeah, go on.
Okay, I take back the things about espresso and pasta. You have a steak and, and a beer.
I cannot really answer your question, but I think, coming back to something we discussed some minutes earlier, outside inside, which is a phenomenon that whom do you trust? For example, we have for economy, for companies, they have to be controlled by Wirtschaftsprüfer, by accountants. And it happens all the time that accountants are pressed to give a statement confirming that everything is okay, but it is not. And they must have known that. Why is that the case? Because here you have different partners. You have the company. Within the company, you have different groups. You have the executive side, you have the supervisory group, the board members, and even more importantly, what they are doing, what the accountants do, they give a confirmation to the outside world, not only to the inside world, but to the outside world. If it is wrong, it is difficult and very dangerous for both sides, for the outside and the inside, because people do not, for management, for example, doesn't realize that something goes wrong, or they realize it by far too late. So that is a question of the level of trust or the quality of trust you need for special professions. By the way, that's also true for lawyers, or should be true for lawyers. But this is a very, very complicated issue, and you have prejudices in all these groups and against all these groups. Yeah. Very difficult.
Good. So thank you very much for these insights. Actually, it's also our role to conclude on this, that we as an international institution overcome those prejudices as much as possible, and really to show how much trust one can have also towards those with other backgrounds, other nationalities, and other sets of original values. So in that sense, thank you very much, first of all, to you for very, very actively contributing to this debate. Thank you very much to you, Gianluca, for your insights and for taking on the role as a chairholder. Thank you very much to Ingrid and Manfred for providing the opportunity to have this chair. And with this, before we I would like to ask you for a big round of applause. I have the trust that some drinks are available now for our reception. So thank you very much.
Thank you.